Suppose a critic was willing to grant that the New Testament records are fully accurate. Should that lead them to a conclusion that Jesus was resurrected? As we're about to see, some don't even think that's enough. Some of the weirdest arguments that can be made by atheists are those that actually take for granted that the supernatural does occur. This is Robert Greg Cavin. You may never have heard of him, and you wouldn't be missing much if you hadn't. He is a philosopher who is the inventor of some of the looniest arguments against Christianity you'll likely ever see. And sometimes it's hard to tell if he wants to be taken seriously or not. Cavin says that there's insufficient evidence for the resurrection, even if we grant the full historicity of the New Testament. And here's how we can sum up his argument. In the end, one might indeed be excused for thinking that Cavin's evidential scheme against the resurrection deserves no answer other than this one. By Cavin's own rules, this is sufficient to cast doubt upon his claim to be a serious scholar. Evidence for this scenario is not necessary. It's conceptually possible, after all. Cavin may respond that his claim to be a scholar is not as outrageous as the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. But strictly speaking, the outrageousness of a claim has no bearing in terms of refuting conceptually possible ideas. Ultimately, the matter is one of regurgitating Hume again. When we find a certain idea personally incredible, then I am free, under Cavin's evidential scheme, to offer a conceptually possible substitute without needing evidence. But for the sake of argument, let's expand on the matter. Is Cavin's demand that we can't be sure Jesus was really resurrected unless we're able to be sure he didn't die of old age in 1300 AD any good? The pose is a curious one, since the Jesus who comes back from the dead to die of gangrene hundreds of years later has already undergone some sort of miraculous recovery. That begs an explanation, and is contrary to what is possible in Cavin's materialistic worldview. Tossing into the air a wide variety of conceptually possible scenarios is not an answer to this conundrum, nor does it grant any privilege above and beyond the interpretive template offered by the New Testament. In a court of law, juries are sometimes required to render a verdict based on circumstantial evidence. However, when that is what is used, no accounting is made for offering conceptually possible explanations as a way to erase doubts. Perhaps the most famous example of this sort of tactic was during the O.J. Simpson trial, when Johnny Cochran put before the jury the speculation that Simpson's victims had been killed by Colombian drug lords, who had been seeking a relative of one of the victims who had not paid up on a drug debt. Critics can easily see problems in this scenario, such as that drug dealer executions are performed with guns rather than knives of the sort that killed the Simpson victims. Of course, Cochran may in turn have argued that this was an unusual case because the dealers wanted to send a graphic message. However, adding epicycles of evidence does not prove the case any further, and Cavin's responses to these proofs amount to little more than Colombian drug lord explanations. It is certainly true that we have no direct evidence that Jesus would not have been able to be destroyed by a hydrogen bomb. However, the direct evidence Jesus provided functions as circumstantial evidence that he would have been able to survive such attempts. Cochran's Colombian drug lord scenario rightly raised questions concerning Cochran's ethics as an attorney. In the same way, it is patently dishonest for Cavin, as a skeptic, to float as a trial balloon the idea that Jesus was miraculously revived in a lesser sense than resurrection, or that he was fooled by aliens. While he acknowledges that such ideas would have their own problems, in his view, he is presenting this as a viable alternative for persons without a materialistic worldview, and therefore the ethical problem remains intact if indeed it does not become worse. Cavin would be like the defense attorney who promotes the drug lord's thesis, himself not believing it to be true, but hoping in some way to sway a less critical jury to let his client, whom he knows the evidence shows to be guilty, off scot-free from his crime. Circumstantial evidence is not the best possible evidence. Jesus surviving at the center of a nuclear explosion would constitute direct evidence of his resurrection, and would of course be nice to have. But it is hardly necessary to have it to accept that Jesus was resurrected. To claim otherwise is to raise the bar of evidence arbitrarily high on the basis of one's own presuppositions and biases. Cavin's evidential scheme is an indication of just how far afield critics must reach in order to disprove the resurrection, and how unethical they are willing to be in order to get others to follow them in their disbelief.